All right, everyone. Well, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Jordan Przinski, and I'm the Director of Membership with Good Business Colorado. Good Business Colorado is a grassroots organization of values-driven businesses, rejecting partisanship and advocating for a prosperous economy, equitable communities, and a sustainable environment. Our members believe that business success cannot be measured by profit alone, and that true success means that our planet, communities, and bottom lines are all thriving. Before we get started this afternoon, I do want to give a quick shout out to all of our fantastic partner organizations for today's event. The Alliance Center, Be Local Colorado, the Center for Community Wealth Building, the Latino Chamber of Commerce of Boulder County, the Latino Chamber of Commerce of Pueblo, Small Business Majority, Startup Colorado, and the Longmont Sustainable Business Program. Just a reminder that after today's event, you will receive a follow-up email that will include a link to a survey. If you could take 2 minutes to provide any sort of input or feedback on today's virtual event, we would certainly appreciate that. There will also be a link to the recording if you would like to review this, this webinar or share it out amongst your networks. So thanks again for joining us today. And for now, I'll kick it off to Karen Moldovan to get us started.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for hopping on another Zoom and joining in on another virtual discussion. My name is Karen Moldovan, and I am the Policy Director over at Good Business Colorado. I just wanted to quickly introduce myself because I'll be moderating the question and answer chat box a little bit later on. Wanted to also quickly give folks a little bit of background on the impetus for this discussion. So, a couple months ago, Good Business Colorado, we surveyed our members. We have about 300 small businesses that are GBC members about the upcoming ballot and what were the ballot measures that mattered the most to them, what were they interested in us endorsing as an organization. And we got some clear answers on some, but I would say this one in particular, Amendment B, what we got was a lot of questions and a little bit of confusion, frankly. Folks just saying, sounds good, sounds interesting, but I really don't know. I don't really understand it. I feel like I need some more education on this. I'd like to talk through it a little bit more and understand the impact. So really what we heard was folks wanted to be able to have a little bit of an educational session to learn more and see all sides. And I think it's really an important time to be able to hold that space because we are all navigating so much right now. And folks have different responsibilities and are working differently and new stresses and worries and this giant blue book probably sitting on your coffee table that you don't feel like you have a ton of time to really dive in. So hopefully in this hour, we can answer some of your questions and hear from a couple different perspectives on the ballot measure to potentially repeal the Gallagher Amendment. So as I mentioned, we'll be using that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to type in questions whenever, but we'll hold some time for discussion at the end and keep your lines muted, but we will definitely have time for questions and our hope is to have a discussion. So I'm gonna turn it over first to, we'll first hear from Senator Dominic Moreno. We're thrilled to have him here, and he's going to tell you a little bit more about himself and why he is advocating on behalf of the passage of this ballot measure.
Wonderful. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Jordan, for having us. Thank you, Clay, for being here. And my appreciation to everyone that's tuning in today. Very much appreciate the mission of Good Business Colorado, looking at things that are in a world that is more than just about profit, but actually how can we, how can you all as a business community do good in the community as well. And so very much appreciate that. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. So if you are feeling confused by Amendment B, you are not alone. It is extremely complex. There's a lot of nuances to this policy, and it also interacts with a variety of other constitutional amendments that Colorado has as well. And so it's a very complex subject. So totally understand if you are feeling confused. Hopefully by the end of this, Clay and I will be able to shed some additional light and alleviate some of that confusion for you. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have a slide deck prepared, and I hope that you all can see that. Looks like you can. All right, so we're going to go ahead and just get started. So I'm representing the, and I should say, sorry, I'm State Senator Dominic Moreno. I represent Adams County in the state Senate. It includes the communities of Commerce City, Westminster, Federal Heights, and southern unincorporated Adams County. I've been in the legislature now for about 8 years. And for 4 of those years, I've served on the Joint Budget Committee, which is the committee that is charged with developing a balanced budget each year. And so I very uniquely see the effects of some of the fiscal constraints that we have in our state constitution and how it affects our ability to provide services to our residents. So with that being said, Amendment B is a bipartisan plan to really protect the entities that depend on your local property tax. If you're wondering what those entities are, it depends on where you live, but it can range from your school district to your fire district, your water district. A lot of communities have parks and recreation districts as well that depend on your property tax. Your counties depend on your property tax. So there are a lot of different government functions that are reliant on property tax for their revenues. I should also point out that Amendment B would not raise the property tax rate. I've received a lot of questions about this amendment, and for most people, their bottom line is, what is this going to do to my property tax? And that's a very relevant question and an important one. Your tax rate will not change if Amendment B passes. Now, Gallagher left unchecked is on track to provide some additional homeowner property tax relief, but we can get into the reasons why you may not actually see that on your property tax bill. Property values have risen extremely quickly in Colorado, and for a lot of reasons, that has led to people not really seeing that relief that Gallagher was intended to provide because property values are rising so quickly. And we'll get into a little bit more of that a bit later. So Amendment B really helps our local businesses. So if you think about, so Gallagher was envisioned that it would have this constant split of the revenues for property tax. So 55% of all property tax revenues would come from commercial sources. Now, think of commercial sources as any commercial activity, right? So the grocery store, your local businesses in your community, the daycare, anything that is identified as a commercial property is essentially taxed at a commercial rate. The other side of that coin, 45% of all property tax revenues were scheduled to come from residential property tax. So think your home that you live in. That is, now what's really interesting about Gallagher is that it was put into place at a time when there was a fairly equal divide of commercial properties to residential properties in Colorado. That is no longer the case. Residential properties make up about 80% of the property tax base in Colorado now, whereas commercial properties only make up 20% of the tax base, property tax base. So the challenge there being that it has really put a disparate burden on commercial properties and on local businesses. So what it does is essentially it removes the 1982 Gallagher Amendment, which as we've spoken about briefly, really means that our local property tax districts have suffered. Your fire districts, first responders, hospital districts in rural areas that depend on property tax have all had less revenue because of the Gallagher Amendment. The other big entity that we've talked a little bit about that depends on your property tax is your K through 12 school district. So, it's really interesting, actually, the change that Gallagher has put into place. Before Gallagher was in effect, about 2/3 of all funding for schools came from your local school district, came from your property tax. That is now flipped. It is essentially meant that the state provides 2/3 of the funding for K through 12 schools, and now only 1/3 comes from your local school district or your local property tax. It is meant that the K through 12 share of the state budget is now about 40% of the general fund. It is more than any other entity that we put more money towards at the state level. So Amendment B, like I said, eliminates that formula that has become outdated because it, Colorado has changed. And so the formula doesn't have a lot of relevance. What, I mentioned that the local districts have been affected, your local property tax districts, but this is especially true in rural areas and lower income areas in Colorado, particularly for areas that, where the schools don't have the property tax value in their community. So I live in Commerce City, for example. It's a lower income community compared to those of like Cherry Creek or Vail. And it means that we have less funding, less of a property tax base. So ultimately, we cannot generate the same amount of local revenue to support our schools as some of those other areas in Colorado. Lastly, what Amendment B really does is helps our local businesses by freezing the residential assessment rate. So, under Gallagher, if nothing changes, we would again see another cut to residential property taxes, which means that there will be an even bigger burden on commercial property taxpayers. Our businesses will have to pick up that slack from the residential property tax. And so particularly now in the midst of a pandemic where we see local businesses are struggling more than ever, I'm sure many on this call can relate to that. We really should try to do everything we can to protect local businesses. So this is just a little bit more information on Gallagher. Again, it's a 40-year-old amendment. Colorado looks different today than it did 40 years ago. And so, this is an effort to really try to bring us up to modern times. So we talked a little bit about this already, but essentially what it is, passed in 1982, required that 45-55 split that I mentioned earlier. And this is kind of how it all works. So in the Constitution, commercial property taxpayers are required to pay 29% of the value of their property in property tax. Whereas on the residential side, it used to be a lot higher than it is today. Under Gallagher, I think the residential assessment rate was at something like 21% when it went into effect. And you can see now, because of that ratio split that is required, it has really forced residential assessment rates down. And so where we stand today is at 7.15%. I'll just note that something on how property taxes work in general, because I think it's very confusing. And I want to make sure everyone understands. You actually don't pay property tax on the full value of your property. You pay property tax on a percentage of the value of your property. That is what we call the residential assessment rate. So it is 7.15% today. So you pay property tax on 7.15% of the value of your property. It is meant that Colorado has about the third lowest residential property tax in the country. So it has really forced residential property tax rates down. And so this again is just a little bit of information about some of the unintended consequences of Gallagher. If nothing changes, if Amendment B does not pass, instead of business property tax rates being 4 times higher than residential rates, it'll be 5 times higher. Again, local property tax districts like first responders, hospitals, fire districts, again, will see revenue decreases. And our schools, again, will also see local revenue decreases that will increase pressure on the state budget, that we essentially have to backfill everything that school districts lose in local property tax revenue. A little bit about who has endorsed Amendment B. You can see a wide range of publications throughout Colorado, but also a great mix of different community organizations from all sides of the political spectrum have endorsed this amendment. And then this is just the straight text of Amendment B that you will see on your ballot when you vote. The Blue Book has a lot more information, as I'm sure you know. You probably received it in the mail. It's over 100 pages long, and it is one of the longest Blue Books that we've had in recent memory. There are a lot of really consequential issues that you will be asked to weigh in on this election cycle. All right, so that kind of ends my slide deck, and I will stop sharing my screen, and I have probably only confused you even further. But I'm looking forward to the discussion because it's an important issue, and looking forward to hearing what Clay has to say as well.
Thank you so much, Senator. That was a great overview. Just wanted to, and thank you for sharing why you're a proponent of this measure. Just want to remind folks, we do have that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I'm really surprised that there are any questions yet. We are going to be holding them till the end, but if folks want to go ahead and type in your questions while they're fresh in your mind, please do. I do hope we can dive in a little bit deeper because I know this is some pretty weighty material. So next we're going to turn it over to Clay Vagoda, and he is going to introduce himself and talk through a little bit some ways that he's looking at this from a different side as an opponent. Thanks, Clay.
Karen, I appreciate it, and I appreciate everybody joining us here today, and Senator Marino, nice to see you. I'm sure I'm going to confuse things a little bit more because I come from a totally different standpoint on this than the senator does. Three things that Amendment B does is it's a tax increase on homeowners, it's a tax increase on renters, and while it's a huge tax decrease on big businesses, oil and gas interests, and corporations, the thing that's most concerning about it is that it doesn't deal with the issue that Colorado is facing right now. Let me work my way through this because the senator hit on a couple of these things, but he didn't put numbers to it, and I think that that's important. And I want you to know going in that the numbers that I'm going to be using, all the numbers I'm going to be using, unless I tell you differently, are numbers that come from the tax administrator of the state of Colorado. That's a division of Colorado Local Affairs Department, and so she's the one who collects all the taxes, and it will be either her numbers that she's done before, or it will be through some testimony that she gave the state legislature. Because of the way Gallagher works, which is it varies the tax assessment rate on this, when Amendment B starts off by saying without changing the tax rate, but we don't care about tax rates as individuals. We care about the money in our pocket, and we care about how much of it is going out for taxes. And if Amendment B passes, at a minimum, without looking at any of the increased value on property, it will cost homeowners in this state $450,566,168 in the first year. And that goes on every single year from that point forward. In year 5, without taking any increase in the value of residential property, it's a $2.25 billion tax increase. More money out of your pocket while the rate hasn't changed at all. And that makes Amendment B the largest tax increase in the history of Colorado. And so when we talk about this, we need to talk about not about rates, but about money out of your pocket. And because we're in a global pandemic and we have this huge economic downturn, We have 500,000 Coloradans who are either unemployed or underemployed right now. And we have in August, 32% of the mortgage holders nationwide either didn't pay their mortgage on time or in full. And so we're in the midst of this huge economic downturn. And if you take the projections of the tax administrator on what that means to the non-residential property taxes, she's looking at oil and gas interest that might have gone down as much as 32%, commercial interest that might have gone down as much as 20%. All said and done, if you take her numbers, there is over $1 billion less property tax that will be collected on the non-residential side. So Amendment B is a tax increase on homeowners, but it isn't. But the decreased amount that comes from commercial won't make up for the budget shortfall. So the special districts that the senator talked about, the school districts that the senator talked about, all the governmental activities are still going to be down somewhere in the neighborhood of $600 to $800 million. So going forward, Amendment B doesn't actually solve the problem. The tax issue in Colorado has always been not just Gallagher, and I will be the first to say we have a tax problem in Colorado, and we need to look at the entire tax system. And that's the Gallagher Amendment, that's the Tabor Amendment, and that's Amendment 23, which requires money to go to schools. And those three things work together to create a really terrible place. And we've known this since the Tabor Amendment passed in the early 90s. And this is nothing new to the legislature. The frustrating thing is that instead of actually applying themselves to the issue and saying, we're going to have this huge shortfall, and there's a number of different things that we can do, from going after the entire tax issue and trying to reform the tax system in Colorado, to doing things like putting off the decrease of assessments. Going after the Gallagher Amendment only takes away the only tax protection and tax benefit that most homeowners in the state of Colorado have. Over the last 38 years, it saved homeowners $35 billion. And now, because we're in a short-term economic downturn, and we haven't for the last 30 years applied ourselves to the tax issues that we have, we're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater and try and get this hit on this, and we still are going to be shortfalls in everything that we're doing. The issues that we have in Colorado is that, with our funding that the senator talked about rural communities versus urban communities. If you live along the Front Range, generally the Gallagher Amendment hasn't affected you that much because we do have high value properties and we have density that includes that. And it is really in the rural and the lower economic areas where the biggest hit is on this. But the Gallagher Amendment only is in Colorado. There's nothing like it across the country. But in 49 other states, they have the exact same problem. The difference between rural and urban and the disparity on that isn't because of the Gallagher Amendment. It's because of a mindset about what government means for rural areas generally, that they don't look for as many, they aren't willing to pay for as many governmental services, and they frankly don't want more governmental services. And when they have an opportunity to vote for them, they don't do that. And this issue isn't created by the Gallagher Amendment. Does the Gallagher Amendment continue to push that disparity? Yes, it does. But once again, we're looking at what the solutions are on this. And we don't have those solutions. And I think it's disingenuous of the drafters of Amendment B to have started this off with the first words, not raising the tax rate, when they know that that is confusing and that is a hidden, that's basically magic. Look over here at rate and don't look at the dollars going out of your pocket. That's not truthful. And Senator Moreno talked about the Blue Book. When they went through and did the Blue Book language for Amendment B, the staff went through and for 3 months, they had this whole process of putting out, their charge for the legislative committee staff legislative council staff is to put it out, a blue book that is accurate and true and gives taxpayers and voters a real look at what this does. When they got to the blue book on Amendment B, through a series, they went through this whole process as they put out what they thought was an accurate description. Both sides had an opportunity to comment. The comments came back. They put out a new draft. They did this 3 times over 3 months. And when it got to legislative council committee, the elected officials, they changed all of that. Now, we went to court to just try and stop the printing of the blue book because it's not accurate. And we came up with 18 different places where it wasn't accurate. And the response by the legislature was to go to court and say, you don't have any standing with us. That they didn't apply themselves at all to the falsehoods that we noted that were put in the blue book. Their thing was, we're the legislature. The judicial branch has no oversight over us, so we can do what we want and we are above the law. And they're correct in that. But I found it interesting that they didn't have an answer to the 18 places where the blue book isn't correct. And that's the problem that we have with this. There's a bipartisan committee on both sides. Senator Moreno has both Republicans and Democrats who are supporting him. We have, the former Democratic Speaker of the House. We have Republicans. Both sides look at this differently, but accuracy and honesty is the biggest issue. And that's my biggest problem with Amendment B. I'm a small business owner. I own commercial strip centers. And if Amendment B passes, my taxes really won't go down because the tax rate will there. I may see a momentary dip because I've lost value, but it doesn't really change that. And my tenants might see a couple $100s a year in their triple net leases. The people who really benefit from this will be oil and gas interests and big businesses. And the fact that we have now unhooked tax rates in this state from the Constitution, which means that the 264 pages of lobbyists who are paid to be up at the Capitol now are free to start negotiating out how businesses will pay and how oil and gas interests will pay. And taxpayers lose their only tax abatement on this. And one thing we know for sure is that people up at the legislature aren't paying attention to small business by and large, and they definitely aren't paying attention to residential homeowners. And so from a business standpoint, you might see a little break, but that is more than going to be made up for the fact that on your property taxes, it doesn't make a difference if you own or you rent. Because if you're renting, the amount you pay will continue to go up because affordable housing gets further and further out there because the tax rates go up. And so you have this problem that we're not dealing with the problem. We're hitting residential people. The people who might benefit the most are the big corporations that don't pay their share anyway. And we have an amendment that is lying to us from the first statement it makes. It's not about rate, it's about dollars out of your pocket. I'll stop now so we can take some of the questions because I see them popping up. So I think you'd rather get answers rather than hear me, rattle on.
Well, thank you to you both. And I am glad to say that we are getting a lot of dialogue via the Q&A box as well as on Facebook Live. So I'm going to do my best to get through them, reminding everybody this is a complicated issue and there's a lot to cover. I do want to give both of you a chance to respond, but I think we probably do need to keep an eye on the time and keep remarks somewhat limited if we can, just to be respectful of the hour that we have. So there's a few questions, specifically people wanting to untangle the property tax issue. So asking, will there be a new formula or plan for calculating the property tax rate if this passes? And then questions on Facebook Live about, I don't really understand the property tax piece because mine have been going up for the past 3 years as it is. So if this is repealed, people do want to understand a little bit more about what this triggers in terms of their property taxes. So Senator, I don't know if you want to start first, and then Clay, if you have additional comments on that piece.
Sure.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I think it's a great question, because if Amendment B goes away, the point in which Clay and I agree is that it is one of the only protections on limitations of property tax that exist. That is accurate. The challenge for me has always been that it's in our state constitution. So anytime you want to do anything, the legislature actually, even if we start to see these problems develop, we can't do anything. All we can do, which is what we've done here with Amendment B, is refer a measure to you all to make the final decision. And that happened in the legislature this last session. 2/3 of the elected representatives on both sides of the aisle agreed that we would put this question to voters. Now, it's a completely relevant question to ask, well, what comes next then, right? If Amendment B is gone, what happens then? And it's a great question. Part of one of the critiques, one of the concerns that we heard is that immediately, right, lobbying will start to happen on, individual classes of certain industries, or property owners would start to lobby the legislature to then start to reduce their property tax rate, because now that there is no limitation on property taxes in the state constitution, the legislature is kind of free to do whatever we want. One of the things that was done was a bill was passed in conjunction with Amendment B to freeze property tax rates across the board. So that language is now in statute that says there will be a freeze. Now, of course, the legislature can go back and change state law. That is how state law works. We can always revise, we can introduce new bills. That is the nature of the legislative process. A couple of things that I do disagree with. I think it's important to remember that it is all commercial property tax owners that pay the commercial property tax rate. So I think it's easy to point to corporations, it's easy to point to oil and gas, but the reality is those entities are not the only ones that make up commercial property tax payers. It is the small businesses, it is the retail businesses on your corner, it's the grocery stores, it's the gas station. All of those are commercial property taxes, and they pay the commercial property tax rate. So I think that's just important to remember. The other thing that I would point out is that, in terms of residential property tax owners, personally, I pay very close attention to what residential property tax owners say in my district. The reality is that those are the people that vote. They have the strongest lobby of all, because they determine whether or not someone is reelected to their seat. And so, to say or to suggest that residential property tax owners would have no recourse, no one to go to, no thing to rely on, I don't think is exactly accurate, because these are the folks that vote in elections, and they are the ones that have the ultimate say on if an elected official isn't looking out for them. So those are just a couple of my thoughts.
And Senator, I guess I would say that yes, obviously it's the voters who vote for you, but when you look at the finances of who actually funds the election, I think that gives a clearer picture that generally, in the 35 years I've been doing politics in the state of Colorado, there are very few candidates who don't take PAC, association, corporate checks. And that's really how politics runs. And I think we all understand that. I think that one of the things that, you hit on a couple issues that I want to note. The fact is that there are a number of ways that the legislature could have changed the Gallagher Amendment to have made it fairer to smaller businesses, to mom and pop businesses, and to take away the people on the residential side who are getting an unfair advantage. Unquestionably, because there are only two classes, residential and non-residential property owners in the state of Colorado. If you own a second home up in the mountains, or if you are doing very well in this economy and you have a very high-priced house, the Gallagher Amendment keeps your taxes lower than it probably should. And there was an opportunity to start to slice and dice both residential and non-residential property taxes. Residential could break out people who do second homes or homes over a certain value. On the non-residential side, I think that what really would need to be done on this is that you start to break out oil and gas interests, big corporations, away from the small moms and pops. Because there is no question that they are the ones who are getting hurt most as a percentage of what their income is. But we didn't do that. Instead, we went and took a sledgehammer to this thing and said, you know what, let's get rid of it. And they've been trying to get rid of it for the last 38 years. I mean, the last time they tried to do this, the taxpayers dropped it back and said no to this by an 80-20 margin. And in the midst of a pandemic, I can't think of a worse time to start to go after people when they are hurting the most. And to get to that place where we actually are funding our special districts, you know, because of Tabor, you can decrease taxes that people pay, but you can't increase them except for by a vote of the people. And that's what we're going through with Amendment B. That's also what every special district, all 3,800 of them in the state of Colorado, that's what they can do when they hit shortfalls. They get to go to their local districts and they need to say, we need money for, whether it's libraries, fire districts, roads, police, whatever it is, they can go to those special districts and make their case. And it's the voters of that special district, as small a local election as you can get, who get to make that choice. And they should have that choice on whether or not they want their property taxes up and down. Doing this on a statewide basis by saying, we're just going to, because if the assessment rate doesn't go down, assessment rate's at 7.15 for residential. That's 7.15 on county taxes, school taxes, and for all those special districts as well. And just one thing I hadn't talked about yet, in the last 10 years, the amount of property taxes that have been paid to the state of Colorado have gone up 61%. In the last 10 years, it's almost doubled statewide how much the state has brought in from property taxes. So just like we all in a pandemic, or small business owners, or as just citizens find ourselves needing to budget better, budget tighter, the state's had a big run of more money coming in. They need to buckle down and tighten their budget as well. Putting it all back on the residential homeowners in this kind of economy is just unconscionable.
Can I just add one thing? I think it's important for everyone tuning in to understand that the state does not collect property tax.
The amount of property taxes collected statewide, excuse me yeah, that's correct. It's the amount of property taxes collected statewide that I'm talking about.
Thank you both. So we do have a lot more questions coming in, so let's keep going through these. And I think we could probably save a minute or two at the end for just any sort of closing remarks or statements before we wrap up. But this is sort of a comment / question that's coming from a small business owner in the manufacturing sector who has about 50 employees, and sort of wanted to acknowledge kind of what we've been talking about, that Colorado, we do have this knot, right, of Gallagher, Tabor, Amendment 23. So that's certainly a piece of this, and that essentially because of the requirements of our state constitution, they do need to be dealt with sort of one at a time. It's pretty hard to untangle that knot collectively at the same point. So that is a part of what we're dealing with here. But they're asking for your thoughts on both the pros and cons with the repeal as related to the state budget, specifically for education and higher education. So I know, Senator, you talked a little bit about that, but I think that this is an important issue to a lot of folks in the state. So essentially, they're asking for the presenters to discuss the pros and cons to the state budget as it relates to education. So I think if we could talk about that for a few minutes, and you're both welcome to give your perspective, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, well, first I'll just say I really appreciate the audience member for bringing up the fact that we have a single subject rule in our state constitution, and just a little process for you all. Eventually, you'll have to give me your feedback on how I do, because eventually I may become a civics teacher. But essentially, you know, when Tabor passed, it was a multifaceted, multi-subject constitutional amendment. And, you know, I would say that we reacted hastily to Tabor being adopted into the state constitution and said, this can never happen again, right? We can't have an amendment that addresses multiple and disparate subjects in one ballot measure. And so we passed a single subject rule into our state constitution saying from now on, every ballot measure must address only a single subject. So that is absolutely true. And I really appreciate you for pointing that out because, you know, I agree, like this is a complete knot that we've created in terms of the fiscal constraints in our constitution. But because of that single subject rule, we must address these issues one at a time. We can't put forward a ballot measure to voters that say, would you like to make these revisions to Tabor, then these revisions to Gallagher, and then these revisions to Amendment 23. They all have to be separate and siloed as per the state constitution. Now, in terms of the effects that Amendment B will have on the state budget, I think it's a really great question. And I'm gonna point back to the figures that I referenced earlier. Before Gallagher passed, 2/3 of all support for K through 12 education came from local school districts, came from your property tax. The reality is now that 2/3 of support for K through 12 education comes from the state. Only 1/3 comes from your local property tax. And so what that has meant is that the general fund is under increasing amount of pressure to try to meet all of the needs of the residents of Colorado, all the services that they need, the increases in services from a growing population. And it essentially means we have to do a lot more with a lot less. So we have seen that the K through 12 budget makes up 40% of the general fund now, which is unfortunately the growth there, and all meant to try to reduce the impacts on our local school districts. But the result has really meant that it has resulted in less of an ability at the state level to invest in other areas of priority, particularly higher education. The amount of state support for higher education has decreased dramatically over the course of the last 20 or 30 years. And so it has meant that the tuition has gone up at our state colleges and universities because now families and students have to pay that amount of money rather than the state providing it as a subsidy for in-state residents. And so, you know, if Amendment B does pass, it will mean that we will essentially, for at least going forward, stop the bleeding of local property tax revenues at the local level, which means that the state does not have to backfill as much for K through 12 education going forward, which means that we can invest in really other critical priorities like maybe higher education or transportation or any number of services that state government provides.
Thank you so much.
And I guess, Senator, going back to the tax administrator's numbers, her numbers and estimates as recently as May when she talked to the legislature doesn't support that. If Amendment B passes, at least in the first 2 years on this, the amount of additional property taxes that will be paid from homeowners to school districts is about $256 million. The amount paid by non-residential property tax owners to school districts in that, in that first year, it's about $400 million. So because of the economy and the hit that has been paid, that is hit on non-residential property owners, that's not going to happen. There isn't going to be much more money. There will be less money on this. And so that just, and if Amendment B doesn't pass, there's still going to be that same hit for the school districts. So right now, there will be less money for school districts either way on this. But I want to come back to what you first talked about. I understand that there is a single subject requirement for Colorado ballot measures. What we haven't seen, when I talk about an overall tax reform policy, what we haven't seen is anybody going forward and saying, here's how we're going to piece by piece do this. And Amendment B is first of all these different strategies that get there. I haven't seen that. You know, Dennis Gallagher, who the Gallagher Amendment is named after, has for the last 10 years been very vocal about the fact that he will go out and champion the repeal of the amendment that bears his name if there is an overall strategy for going forward. And nobody has even asked him to be part of that, about part of that discussion on this. And so saying, well, yes, we have to do each piece, and let's make the first hit on homeowners, and no, there's no strategy for going forward on dealing with Tabor and 23 on top of this. I think it would be better off and it would be more effective to go to the taxpayers and say, listen, here's the issue. And it is this complex issue, and we're going to be coming to you either on a series of ballot measures all at once or over time. But this is what we're going to accomplish if you'll support us, and then go out and be honest about it. I think the dishonesty of Amendment B from its first sentence is one of the things that turns people off. You squander the political capital if people actually think that you're being honest with the voters when you talk about tax rates, when you know it's not about tax rates, that it's all about dollars in your pocket. And that's bad, bad politics.
So before we move on to the next question, I did just want to mention that there was a request in the chat box. Clay, you had talked about some of the language specifically in the ballot measure that you perceive as inaccurate and from the Blue Book. So they're asking if you could share what you think is inaccurate and what you think a correction would look like. So
I will be happy. If you'd like to email me directly, clayvagoda@gmail.com, I'd be happy to provide anybody with the text of our complaint to the court, and you'll be able to work it down. You'll have to have your Blue Book there, but all 11 pages that are dedicated to Amendment B. But if you email me, I'll send it to you.
And Clay, if you feel comfortable sharing your email in the chat box, there was a request for that. So I will let you all directly share that information.
Come at me.
All right, so a clarifying question that we do have that I would like to hear both of you address, and hopefully then we can get to a few more. Folks are asking about the disparity between rural and urban taxpayers. So will a failure of Amendment B increase the disparity between rural and urban taxpayers? And can you talk a little bit more about how this impacts business owners and homeowners in different parts of the state?
I mean, I guess my mic's on, so I'll go first. If Amendment B fails, will it increase the disparity? I'm sure that it will. And that once again, that disparity is not so much a disparity about Gallagher, but it's a disparity about mindset, because you see it in every state in the union. Rural areas tax themselves less. They ask less of school districts and of special districts, and they have the opportunity and the option of going and increasing that tax on themselves if they so choose to. Generally speaking, across the country, they don't choose to. And I think that, it's the one thing nobody wants to talk about, but I think that it's the honesty of this is that if they choose not to tax themselves and demand as much, is it unfair that the urban voters who do generally, the success rate of special districts going for increases in this state is very high, because urban voters tend to vote for more services. And so when they come and say, we need more money, generally that tends to happen. And those urban districts or urban voters who do that are in some ways being penalized by the fact that the rural doesn't do that. If we got rid of the tax structure the way it is, and we peeled farming land out of the same category that we put oil and gas and corporate interests on this, that would also give them an opportunity to have a tax break on this. There are lots of different ways to slice and dice this, but we're given this false option that either you do it this way or you don't do it this way. That's not the way it is.
And I'll just add, I do think the Gallagher Amendment has contributed to the urban-rural divide, and if Amendment B doesn't pass, I do think it'll exacerbate that. What's important to understand about this is that, you know, this is just as much honestly about property tax base as it is about property tax rates or money in someone's pocket. The reality is that some parts of Colorado have a much higher property tax base than others. Clay said it himself that folks in the metro area largely haven't been impacted by the Gallagher Amendment, haven't really seen the impacts of the Gallagher Amendment. Because those residential assessment rates are calculated on a statewide basis, it does mean that rural communities have seen the impact pretty in a pretty grave fashion. The reality is that because the continuing effect of Gallagher and pushing down the residential assessment rate has meant that the local districts that do provide services in rural areas have continued to see less and less revenue, more budget cuts. And honestly, these are the very entities that rural Coloradans rely on. They, you know, pay into a hospital district so that, because often it is not a profit-making motive for a hospital to locate in a rural area. So a community gets together and decides to form a taxing district so that they could support that type of service. You know, particularly, obviously, the wildfires occur mostly, if not exclusively, in the rural parts of our state. And for us at a time, especially now when we've seen historic amounts of wildfires this summer, for us to honestly leave a constitutional amendment unchecked, that means that those local fire districts will have less revenue to combat those wildfires than before. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Thank you for sharing that to you both. Next question is from a GBC member that owns a landscaping company. And her question is, you know, if Gallagher stays, what are our other options for reforming the tax code to be more equitable? So just wanting to understand what exactly is on the table here in terms of reforming the tax code. And sort of this comment, to some extent, the argument for keeping it seems to be that repealing Gallagher doesn't go far enough to fix the issues unless Tabor is repealed. So what other options do we have at this point? So I'm not sure who wants to take that first.
Well, I'll start. I think the first thing, the best way to do this is to get rid of this category of residential or non-residential, because I don't think residential treats small, blue collar people who own a $100,000 house fairly when it looks at people who own multi-million-dollar homes and people who are doing second homes. That is a problem in that, and I think that you need to have more divisions in there. I think you need to have more divisions inside the non-residential. I mean, I think that it is a dog whistle to this group in particular, but to small business owners across the state when they talk about that this is unfair to small businesses. I agree. My tenants are getting killed. I get killed as a real estate person on this. Not treating me the same way that you treat corporations like Excel or corporations like Coors Molson or corporations of large numbers and oil and gas interests across the state. That's not fair. That's not fair to small business. I don't think any of my tenants think that they are getting the same shake that some of these big corporations are. And I think that, that's exasperated by something that you see on a national basis. In the last year, a study came out, 91 of the Fortune 500 companies didn't pay a penny in federal taxes. Now, we're not talking federal taxes here, but we are talking fairness and how big businesses and corporations look at things instead of the people who are the mom and pop shops and small business. And to lump them all together and say, well, it's good for small business and they get a couple hundred when corporations are seeing millions of dollars in tax write-offs, that's an issue. We need to start to break the categories into smaller divisions. And we need to come up with a comprehensive strategy of getting rid of the limits of Tabor that have crippled this state, of dealing with Amendment 23, which has required us not only to backfill into school districts, but we have this mysterious fund that we put money that we know at some point in time we're going to have to pay, but we don't have the money for. So it's this big, ghost of dollars that at some point in time somebody's going to have to pay for, and we have to deal with Gallagher. Give us a strategy for pushing forward. That's why we elect our elected officials, to deal with these hard issues. But to go out there and say, God, we can't do any of it, but let's make sure that homeowners pay more. That's ludicrous.
Senator Moreno?
I love this question, and thank you for asking it, because you essentially described my life for the past year and a half. This is what I've dedicated my time to in the legislature, is figuring out ways to reform our tax code to make it more equitable, to make corporations and big businesses pay their fair share. So just I said this earlier, but bears repeating, the state receives no property tax. So it's really only local property tax entities that depend on property tax. That is a provision of Tabor that says that the state cannot collect any property tax. So where the state revenue comes from is through income tax filings and sales tax filings. What's so interesting about this is I served on a tax expenditure evaluation committee. Believe it or not, we have over 200 different tax expenditures on the books in our tax code in Colorado. And think of a tax expenditure as an exemption, a deduction, what's the other word for it? A credit, really anything that lowers the tax that is owed by a person or a certain industry. We have over 200 of them on the books. And believe it or not, before this interim committee started meeting, we had no standard process to routinely evaluate those expenditures to figure out, do they still make sense? Are they having the intended effect that we had hoped? We have started the process of evaluating all those different expenditures, and when they don't make sense, to start looking at taking them off the books or to modifying them in some way. We've started that work. We introduced a number of bills this last session to make modifications to expenditures or to repeal them altogether. The other really interesting piece of this is that we can't really do much at the state level about the federal tax code and tax at the federal level. In fact, we're uniquely disadvantaged in that sense because we start our collection of state income tax from federal taxable income. That is unique. It is not many states do it that way. Many other states start with adjusted gross income as the basis for their state income tax, but we start with federal taxable income. And we have this thing called rolling conformity, which essentially means that any changes in the federal tax code that are made are automatically adopted into our Colorado tax code. Now, we've had Congress, we've had the executive branch at the federal level institute a number of tax breaks over the years, which have automatically been adopted into our Colorado tax code because of that rolling conformity issue that I mentioned. What's interesting about this is even the CARES Act money, right, which a lot of entities received support through, from the PPP loans to the support for state and local governments, that even came with a tax break for certain businesses. And that's not something that's often talked about. But I introduced a bill this last session that did pass that instead of providing tax relief to the wealthiest folks in Colorado, so those folks that have, that make above $1 million in revenue each year, rather than provide that tax relief, we instead decided to decouple from those federal tax changes and allow that tax relief to go through for those middle or lower income businesses in Colorado, but for the highest earners, we captured that additional revenue and put it towards K through 12 education. So again, an example of, again, trying this process of making our tax code more fair, and you're going to see a lot more activity on that issue in coming years in the legislature.
Thank you both for this conversation. We are actually at time, and I'm noticing that some of our participants are having to leave, but I think this was a really robust dialogue. I don't know how many folks feel less confused, but I think we've given people a lot to think about, some different perspectives and some ideas to really reflect on when they do go to vote. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Senator Moreno, Clay, we really appreciate the time and energy. We would love to continue the conversation. So if folks do want to share your contact information, please do. And to all of our attendees, you will get a survey. Please let us know what ongoing conversations you want us to host. You know, we know that folks are spending a lot of screen time right now, but we want to be able to give our small businesses the information they need during this really challenging time. So thank you again, everyone. We really appreciate the conversation and looking forward to working with you in the future. Take care.
Thanks for having us.